To be sure, the heart, in so far as it's heeded, invariably has something to say about what may come to pass. But what does the heart know? Scarcely a thing about what has actually taken place. Going back to the far-off years of her youth, always, as long as she lived, Lida Mantovani remembered the birth with emotion, and, particularly, the days immediately before it. Every time she thought back to it, it affected her. For more than a month, she had been living stretched out on a bed at the end of a corridor, and for all that time she had done nothing other than gaze through the window opposite, generally wide open, at the leaves of the big old magnolia tree growing right in the middle of the garden below. Then, towards the end, 3 or 4 days before she went into labour, she abruptly lost interest even in the magnolia's black, lustrous, almost oily leaves. She had even stopped eating. A thing, that's what she'd been reduced to, a sort of very swollen, insensible thing. Even though it was still only April, it was already hot, abandoned down there at the end of a hospital ward. She ate hardly anything any more. But Professor Bargelesi, then Director General of Maternity, kept saying that it was for the best. He would observe her from the foot of the bed. "It really is hot," he said, smoothing his thick white beard stained with nicotine around the mouth, with those fragile pink fingers of his. "If you want to be able to breathe as you'll need to, it's best to stay on the light side. And anyway," he added, smiling, "anyway, I would say you're quite big enough." After the birth, time began to flow once more. At first, thinking of David, bored and discontented, he hardly ever spoke to her. He would spend whole days in bed, his face hidden behind a book or simply sleeping. Lida Mantovani tried to keep going alone in the furnished room in the tenement block on Via Mortara, where she had lived with him for the last 6 months. But then, a few weeks on, by now convinced that David wouldn't be showing up again and aware that the few 100 lire that he had given her were nearly gone, and since in addition there were signs that her milk was running out, she decided to go back home to her mother. And so it was that in the summer of the same year, Lida reappeared in Via Salinguera, and once again took up residence in the miserable room with the dusty wooden floor and the paired iron bedsteads, where she had spent her childhood, adolescence, and the early years of her youth. Although the place was a basement, which once had been used as a wood store, getting into it was not easy. Once one was in the entrance hall, which was as broad and dark as a hayloft. One had to climb up a little stairway which cut off from the left-hand wall at a slant. The stairs led to a low doorway, and beyond the door, with a beamed ceiling just at head height, one was suddenly on the brink of a kind of well. "Christ, how wretched," said Lida to herself on the evening of her return, lingering for a moment up there, looking down. And yet, what a feeling of peace and protection as well. With the baby in her arms, she went very slowly down the steps of the inner stairs, moved towards her mother, who meanwhile had looked up from her sewing, and then bent over to kiss her on the cheek. And the kiss, without their exchanging a single word either of greeting or of comment, was readily returned. Almost immediately, there arose the issue of a christening. As soon as she'd taken in the situation, her mother crossed herself. "Are you mad?" she exclaimed. While her mother talked, declaring agitatedly that there wasn't a minute to lose, Lida felt all ability to resist her fade away. At the hospital, when they came to her bedside to take the baby and asked her merrily what name she wanted to give him, it was the sudden notion of not doing anything contrary to David, which forced her to say no, that they should leave her be, that she wanted a bit longer to think about it. But now, why on earth should she still hang back? What sense was there in waiting any longer? The same evening the baby was taken to Santa Maria in Vado. The mother organised it all. It was she who, in memory of a departed brother whom Lida hadn't even known about, wanted the name Ireneo. On their way to the church, mother and daughter walked briskly, as if followed. But they came slowly back along Via Borgo di Sotto, where the council lamplighter was lighting the street lamps one by one, and felt suddenly emptied of all energy. The next morning they got back to work, sitting as they used to, as always, beneath the oblong window that looked up onto the street above, bending over the sewing, rather than the time which had just passed and had been so bitter for each of them. They preferred on and off to talk about things of no importance. They felt a much closer bond than before, much more like friends. Both understood, however, that their accord could continue only on condition that they avoided any reference to the one subject on which it was based. Sometimes, though unable to resist, Maria Mantovani would risk a joke or a veiled allusion. She would say, with a sigh, "Men are all the same." Or even, "Man's a hunter, and that's a fact." At this point, raising her head, she stared distractedly at her daughter, and remembering, at the same time, the blacksmith of Massa Fiscaglia, who 20 years previously had taken her virginity and left her pregnant, remembering the farmhouse deep in the country 2 or 3 kilometers outside Massa, where she had been born and grew up, and which she, when she too found herself with a little child to bring up, had been forced to leave forever. Now the tangled, greasy hair, the thick, sensuous lips, and the lazy gestures of the only man in her life became equally those of David, the young Ferrara gentleman, a Jew, granted, but a member of one of the most distinguished and wealthiest families in the city, the Camaiole family, who lived on Corso Gioveca, no less, in that great big building which they owned outright, who had been going out for Lida for so long, but whom she had never met, never once seen, not even from a distance. She stared, scrutinized. Thin angular, lined by trouble and care. In Lida she seemed to see herself as a girl again. Everything had repeated itself. Everything, from the start to the finish. One evening she suddenly burst out laughing. She grasped Lida by one hand and pulled her in front of the cupboard mirror. "Just take a look how even we two are the same now," she said under her breath. And while there was nothing to be heard in the room except the hissing of the gaslight, they stayed there for quite a while, gazing at their faces side by side, hardly visible in the fogged mirror glass. It wasn't, of course, as if their relations always went smoothly. Lida didn't always seem prepared to listen without reacting. Another evening, for example, Maria Mantovani had started to tell her own story. Before, that could not have happened. At the end, she came out with a remark which had Lida jumping to her feet. "If his family had been willing," she had said, "he'd have married me." Lying on the bed, her face hidden in her hands, Lida repeated these words to herself and heard again the sigh full of regret that had accompanied them. No, she didn't cry. And her mother, who had run over to her and bent over her, panting, found her dry-cheeked as she rose with a look full of distance and contempt. Otherwise, her moments of intolerance were rare, and when they came upon her, they did so without warning, like violent squalls out of the blue. "Lida," she exclaimed once with a nasty laugh. Her mother had called her by name. "And how it mattered to you that when I went to school I should be sure to write it with a Y. So what were you dreaming I might be when I grew up? Someone on the stage?" Maria Mantovani didn't reply. She smiled. Her daughter's outburst took her back to things far in the past, things of which only she could gauge the importance. "Lida," she said over to herself several times. She was thinking of her own youth. She was thinking about Andrea Tardozzi, the blacksmith of Massa Fiscalio, who had been her sweetheart, her lover, and could have become her husband. She had come to live in town with the child, and every Sunday he did 60 kilometers by bicycle, 30 there and 30 back again. He used to sit where Lida sat now. She seemed to see him again with his leather jacket, corduroy trousers, and his uncombed hair. And then one night, as he was on his way back to the village, he got caught halfway in the rain and went down with pleurisy. After that, she never saw him again. He'd gone to live in Feltre, in the Veneto, a little city up in the hills where he'd got himself a wife and a family. If his relations had been willing, and then if he hadn't got ill, he would have married her, no doubt about it. What did Lida know? What could Lida understand? She alone was in a position to take it in, for both of them. After supper, the first to go to bed was usually Lida. But the other bed, just to the side of the one where she and the child were already asleep, standing in the middle of the still uncleared table, the gas lamp cast its bluish light, often remained untouched until far into the night. With its slightly irregular course and its cobbles half overgrown by grass, Via Salinguerra is a little side street beginning from a broad, lopsided square formed by old clearance work and ending up at the foot of the city walls, relatively close to Porta San Giovanni. We're therefore within the city and, in fact, not so far from the medieval centre, and that is amply confirmed by the appearance of the houses lining either side of the street, virtually all of them very poor and modestly proportioned, and a few tottering with age, undoubtedly among Ferrara's oldest. And yet, taking Via Salinguerra even today, the quality of the silence surrounding one, the peals of the city churches heard from here have a different, almost buried tone, and especially the smells of manure, ploughed earth and byres, suggesting the nearby presence of vast secret market gardens. Everything combines to give the impression that one is already beyond the circuit of the city walls, at the beginning of the open countryside. The peaceful sounds of animals, of poultry, dogs, also of oxen, distant chimes, the odours from the farmyards, the sounds and smells even seeped down to the depths of the basement, where Maria and Lida Mantovani did their work for a gentleman's tailor. Sitting with their backs to the window, as still and quiet as the faded furniture which framed them, like the table, therefore, and the straw-seated chairs, and the long, narrow, coffin-like bed side by side, and the cradle, and the cupboard, and chest of drawers, and the washstand and basin with the jug of water beside it, and behind, only just visible, the small door to the understairs space, which concealed the little kitchen and the lavatory. When they looked up from their materials, it was only to exchange a few words, to see if the baby needed something, to look outside, up above, at the few passers-by, or else at a sudden ring of the bell hanging on the landing above the narrow oblong of the front door, to decide, in silence, after a quick exchange of glances, which of the two was to go and open it. 3 years went by, and there was reason to suppose that a good many others would pass in the same way, without novelty or relief, when life, which seemed to have forgotten they existed, suddenly remembered them through the agency of a neighbour, a certain Benetti, Oreste Benetti, the owner of a bookbinder's shop on Via Salinguerra. The curious insistence with which every evening after supper their neighbour had begun to visit almost immediately assumed, at least for Maria Mantovani, unmistakable significance. Yes, she thought excitedly, that Benetti was actually coming on account of Lida. After all, Lida was still young, very young. All of a sudden she became lively, energetic, even cheerful, without ever butting into the conversations between her daughter and their guest. She limited herself to moving around the room, obviously content just to be there, present but independent, happy to remain on the sidelines, awaiting the occurrence of a marvellous event. Meanwhile, the bookbinder did almost all the talking. The years gone by, he seemed interested in nothing else. When Lida was small, he was saying, just so high, she often dropped by the shop. She would come up to the front and stand on tiptoe so that she could just look over the counter. Signor Benetti, she would ask in a little voice, will you let me have a bit of oiled paper? Certainly, little girl, he replied. Are you going to let me know why you want it? Oh, nothing special. I can use it to cover my exercise book. He would tell on and laugh. although he didn't address himself to one or the other of the two women particularly, his eyes sought only those of Lida. He wanted only her attention, her agreement. And she, while she observed the man opposite her, he had a very large head, certainly proportionate to his powerful body, but not to his height. And above all, there in view on the tablecloth, his big, bony hands knitted forcefully together, the one within the other. She felt that in this at least she had no choice but to fall in with his wishes. Facing him with an attractive reserve, she chatted composedly, calmly, and at the same time, in a way, this gave her a strange pleasure which she'd never experienced before, in a way submissively. The bookbinder seemed conscious of nothing so much as his own importance. Nevertheless, he was continually seeking to make an impact. Once, one of the few occasions when he addressed the older woman, calling her by a Christian name, what was more, it was to remind her of the year in which she came to settle in Ferrara. Could she recall, he said, the cold that year? He could, very well. The piles of dirty snow stayed heaped up along the city streets easily until the middle of April. What was more, the temperature dropped so low that even the River Po froze. Even the Po, he repeated for emphasis, widening his eyes. He felt he could see it still, he continued. The extraordinary spectacle of the river caught in the grip of 20 degrees below zero. Between the snow-covered embankments the water had stopped flowing completely, with the result that a few carters, towards the evening, instead of using the iron bridge at Ponte Lagoscuro to cross the river, on the whole they were carriers of firewood who worked for a sawmill at Santa Maria Maddalena, and now they were coming back from Ferrara, chose to risk their now empty carts on the huge icy expanse. What lunatics! They moved forward slowly, a few meters ahead of the horses, holding the reins in one hand behind their backs, sprinkling sawdust with the other hand, and all the while whistling and shouting like demons. Why were they whistling and shouting? Who knows? Maybe to encourage the horses, or maybe themselves, or maybe to warm up, quite simply. I remember in that famous winter, he said one evening, in the respectful tone which he always adopted when talking about people and things that had to do with religion. An orphan from early childhood and educated in seminary, he still felt towards priests en bloc, a filial respect. I remember in that famous winter, poor Don Castelli used to take us every Saturday afternoon to Ponte Lagoscuro to see the Po. We broke file as soon as we were beyond Porta San Benedetto. 5 kilometers there and 5 to come back. It wasn't exactly a stroll in the garden. But woe betide you if you mentioned the tram to Don Castelli. Even though, given his age, he was gasping for breath, always out in the front he was, always at the head of the group with his good old cassock billowing, and yours truly at his side. Genuine saint, ah yes, and for yours truly a genuine father. I'd just had the child, Maria Mantovani commented under her breath in dialect, taking the opportunity of the silence which followed the bookbinder's speech. In town I felt lost, she went on in Italian. The fact is that I still didn't know anybody. But then again, how could I have thought of going back home? You know what it's like, Oreste. In the countryside, it's really people's attitude that's different. It seemed as if Oreste Benetti hadn't even heard her. It hasn't been cold like that since, except in 17, he said meditatively. Then, with lightning in his eyes, "No, but come on, what am I talking about?" he went on, raising his voice and shaking his head. "Nothing of the sort. In the winter of 17 it was warm there on the Carso. There are some things you'd do better to ask the people who cried off, those one or two draft dodgers of our acquaintance." Sarcasm was used to underline these last words. "Who, as far as the front was concerned, never even got to see a postcard of it." Picking up the uncharacteristically brutal allusion to Andrea Tardozzi, the blacksmith of Massa Fiscaglio, who had been discharged on account of the pleurisy and therefore had not seen active service. In 1910 he'd moved to Feltre, over towards the Alps, where he'd got himself a family. Maria Mantovani was offended and went stiff. And for that evening, driven back to fantasizing alone in her corner about the infinite things in her life which could have been, or which never were, she said no more. As for the bookbinder, once he'd established the distances which he had made it his business to establish, he went back to behaving with all the gentleness and all the chivalry which were natural to him. In general, he spoke mainly about himself and his own past. Until the age of 20, 25, things had gone fairly badly for him, he sighed, from every point of view. After that, he came by his work, his craft, and from then on everything changed just like that. "We craftsmen," he used to say, not without pride, staring straight in Lida's eyes. Without a flicker, Lida calmly met his gaze. And he was grateful to her. It was obvious that she sat there all along on the other side of the table, so silent, so tranquil, so careful in her behaviour as well, to correspond to his secret ideal of womanhood. The bookbinder often went on talking until midnight. Once he had finished personal unburdenings, he would begin to talk about religion, history, economics, and so on, and allow himself to indulge in frequent, bitter observations, but spoken in an undertone, of course, on the anti-Catholic policies of the fascists. In the early days, without stopping listening, Lida would use the tip of her foot to move the cradle in which Ireneo slept until the age of 4. Later, when he'd grown a bit more and had a cot all of his own, he developed into a delicate child. When he was nearly 5, he contracted a prolonged infection, which, apart from permanently undermining his health, undoubtedly played its part in the significant feebleness and instability of his character. She would get up every so often from her chair and, drawing near to the sleeping child, bend over to place a hand on his forehead. In the summer of 1928, Lida turned 25. One evening, as she and Oreste Benetti were seated in their usual places, separated, as always, by the table and the lamp, all of a sudden, with great simplicity, the bookbinder asked her if she would agree to marry him. Solemnly, without showing the slightest surprise, Lida gazed at him. It seemed to her as if she was seeing him for the first time. With unusual attention, she considered every detail of his face. The soft, very black eyes, the high, pale forehead, bounded by an arc of bristling iron-grey hair, cut very short, as soldiers and some priests wear it. And she was amazed to find herself there, noting all this so late, only now. He must have been about 50, at least. All at once she was taken with a sense of anguish. Unable to say a word, she turned for help towards her mother, who had got to her feet, moved towards the table, and was leaning on it with both hands. And yet the grimace of resentment already twisting her mother's lips only increased her confusion. "What's the matter with you?" she shouted furiously at her in dialect. "Will you say what the matter is?" She got up straight away, moved towards the staircase, took the stairs at a run, slammed the door behind her, and came down into the entrance hall beyond. Outside at last, she just leant against the wall of the dark cavity left by the wide-open door and looked at the sky. It was a magnificently starry night. In the distance a band was playing. Where were they playing, she wondered, with the twinge of a sudden wish to be swallowed up in the midst of a merry, boisterous crowd, holding an ice cream like any other ordinary girl. From San Giorgio, in the space beside the church? Or was it from Portereno? Or maybe from Piazza Travaglio itself? But by now her breathing was not so laboured. And now, from behind, filtering through the old brick wall against which she was pressing the whole length of her spine, now she could hear the hushed voice of Oreste Benetti. He was speaking to her mother now, calm, as if nothing had happened. What was he saying? Who knows? But anyway, his voice was enough, the placid, subdued hum of his voice, to persuade her to calm down, to suggest that she go back in. When she reappeared up on the landing, she was once again perfectly in control of herself, of her own thoughts and of her own body. Closing the door, she came down the stairs, neither too fast nor too slow, taking care not to make eye contact with either the bookbinder or her mother. During her absence, the two hadn't moved from the spot, he seated at the table, she standing. And now there they were, silent, looking directly at her, questioningly. She came to the side of the table, sat down again in her place, and barely shrugged her shoulders. And the issue of marriage during the almost 2 more hours that the guest chose to stay, as in fact in the course of the other innumerable evenings which followed, was never touched upon again. But that isn't to suggest that Oreste Benetti harboured any doubts about the answer that sooner or later he would have from Lida. Far from it. As far as he was concerned, from the very first moment, it was as if Lida had already accepted, as if they were already engaged. That was apparent from the altered way in which he treated her, always considerate and gentle, certainly, but on the inside, deep down, with a sort of authority which hadn't been there before. He alone at this juncture, he seemed to imply, was the one to guide her onwards through life. According to him, Lida's character had a signal defect, and this he was prepared to state explicitly, and when he did so, he didn't hesitate to appeal to Maria Mantovani with a sidelong glance. And that was to be looking back over her shoulder all the time, chewing over the past. Why on earth did she not make herself take a look in the opposite direction, towards the future? Pride is a tough opponent. Like the serpent, it worms its way in where it is least to be expected. "You've got to be reasonable," he sighed by way of conclusion. "You've got to be able to stay calm and pull ahead." At other times, though, seeming to contradict himself, it was he, but always by way of hints, allusions, and carefully veiled insinuations, and Lida followed the skilful, unflagging workings of his mind without ever reacting, as if she were hypnotized. It was he who set before her the picture of her misspent youth, her straying, and the urgent necessity of redeeming it with a better maturity, with a life of dignity and serenity. And with regard to that, yes, of course, he gave her to understand. Since he loved her, he, as was natural, understood, excused, forgave everything. But he was not so constrained by his feelings, this should be clear, that he could not remind himself and her that she had committed a great sin, a mortal sin, of which she would be absolved only on the day she became his wife. Whatever had she been thinking? Had she perhaps imagined that a man like him, who, among other things, she should note was nearly 30 years older than her, could be thinking of a relationship outside marriage, Catholic marriage? It was a duty, a mission. The true believer could not conceive of life, nor by consequence of the relationship between a man and a woman, in any other way. All three of them, however, were so edgy, were so on the lookout all the time, that it took very little for the precarious balance of their relationship to falter. Afterwards they would be upset, and there were prolonged sulks. Once, for example, referring to Ireneo, the bookbinder said that he really did love the child dearly, just as if he were his father. Led astray by impulse, he had let himself go a bit too far. "But look, you're Uncle Oreste, aren't you?" Ireneo exclaimed at this point. He was already 7 years old, and every evening before being put to bed he had got into the habit of showing him his homework. "Obviously, I meant it was just a form of words. Whatever were you thinking?" The bookbinder's confusion instantly gave Lida a sense of her own importance, while the good fellow continued talking to the child, making heavy weather of it. She and her mother looked at each other and smiled. But the moments of coldness and spite were basically fairly infrequent. In any case, when it came to avoiding or getting over them, there were the gifts. From the start, Oreste Benetti had been prodigal with them. Although he had let it be understood that after the wedding they would all go and live together in a little suburban house outside Porta San Benedetto, the purchase of which he was talking through with a building firm, he nevertheless put in the wiring for electric light, painted the walls, bought some furniture, an efficient cast-iron stove, a painting, various bits of kitchenware, a pair of flower vases, and so on. As if, although obviously he didn't stop thinking for a moment about the marriage, he hadn't the slightest intention of rushing it. He was in love, he said, with those gifts of his, which were often pointless, it's true, and sometimes a bit absurd. If he was going to marry her, he was going to marry her because he loved her. He had never in his life been engaged, not even once. Neither as a youth, nor, later, as a man in his prime, had he tasted the intoxicating pleasure of giving presents to a fiancée. Now that this pleasure was permitted him, he had every right to want things to go slowly, in stages, with a rigorous regard for all the rules. He turned up every evening at the same time, at 9:30 precisely. Lida would hear him approaching from a distance from the street, and then there would come the vigorous ring on the doorbell announcing his arrival, and there was his steady tread up the stairs on the hall side, and then, up there on the landing, his greeting, his cheery cry, "Good evening, ladies." Finally he would make his way down, starting to hum the aria from The Barber between his teeth, leaving off halfway down the stairs with a well-bred little cough. And immediately the room was full of him, of the little man with the grey hair, who had about him something of the soldier and something of the priest, and of his warm, vivacious, imperious presence. The manner of his arrival was always the same. For years it didn't change. Although she could predict it in every detail, on every occasion Lida was overcome with a sort of calm amazement. She let him approach without even the slightest gesture of getting to her feet. But before, how had it been back in the old days? Oh, back then, when an equally vigorous ring on the bell meant that David, buttoned up in his big blue coat with the fur collar, and stamping his feet on the cobbles from impatience and cold, was waiting for her, as agreed, at the street door. He had never wanted to come in. He'd never felt the need to introduce himself. Then, by contrast, she would have little enough time to pull her top coat out of the wardrobe, slip it on, and then, after closing the wardrobe and peering in the mirror on the door, to put on some makeup in a rush and do her hair. She was allowed only a few seconds. And even so, that was more than enough, because in the mirror, small, her scraped-back hair shining, with the light behind her, she looked almost bald, appearing and quickly vanishing again behind her own shoulders. She would see the grey head of her mother. "Just what are you looking at?" she wheeled round to shout. "You know what I've got to say to you? I've had enough of you and this life." She went out, slamming the door. David didn't like to wait. Still trembling, clutching his arm, she let herself be led. Instead of turning right and heading towards the city centre, they usually went down via Salinguerra all the way to the walls, and then from there, walking fast along the path up on top, they would take about 20 minutes to reach Portareno. It was David who wanted it that way. Since he'd made peace with his family, so that he could extricate himself later on more favourable terms, he said. But as for graduating, though he did absolutely have to graduate, at this stage it was sensible for the two of them to be a bit careful, at the very least avoiding being seen out together. Given the situation, she herself ought to accept that their hanging out the flags, this was his reference to the very early days, when in the evenings, as if for a dare, he would actually take her to Salvini's, when they went and sat in the main cafes in the plain light of day, including La Borsa, when he would declare that, as far as he was concerned, as for the tedious, hypocritical life he'd led up until then, the university, friends, family, he'd had his fill of the whole thing. That with regard to that hanging out the flags, it was time now to draw a line under it. But anyway, wasn't it more fun this way? He quickly added with a smirk. Isn't some opposition, some subterfuge, actually the best stimulant for an affair? In any case, one thing was absolutely sure. Along that path up on the walls, and similarly in the little cinema on Piazza Travaglio where they were heading, there was no chance of anybody from home or from the milieu stumbling across them. Though she had gone rigid, outside and in, she kept by his side in silence. And yet, not long after, almost as soon as she was inside the crowded, smoky auditorium of the Diana, sitting beside David with her eyes fixed on the screen, her nerves instantly untensed. Quite often the movies were love stories in which she thought she could spot similarities to the one in which, despite everything, she still imagined she was the heroine, so that at the climactic moments she felt moved not only to look towards David, there in the half-light intersected in mid-air by the long blue blade of light cast by the projector behind. She could just see his long, thin neck with the bulge just above the knot of his tie, of his big Adam's apple, his displeased, almost drowsy-looking profile, his dark, brilliantined hair, a tiny bit crinkly above the temples. But to take hold of his hand and clasp it desperately. And David, ready as he was to return her gaze and respond to the squeeze, he seemed untroubled, even cheerful. But there could be no counting on it. In fact, after letting her hold his hand for a bit, sometimes he would brusquely pull it away. He would move away bodily, or, if he was still wearing his coat, he would get up to take it off. "It's stifling," she would hear him puff. "There's no air in here." Scared, she didn't try again. She quickly turned back towards the screen, and from then on, David was there, at the centre of the big grey rectangle of light down at the end of the hall, busy lighting a cigarette with gloved hands, dancing in black tie, gazing into the eyes of wonderful, gorgeous women, pressing them to his breast, kissing them lingeringly on the mouth. The film got her into such a state that later, at the end of the show, when she was outside again, if David, slipping an arm under hers and putting on a coaxing voice, suggested taking her back home by the same route they had taken on the way there, every time, as if suddenly waking from a sort of sleep, she gave a violent start. "It's not as if it's much further," David insisted. "It's late. Mum's expecting me back by midnight," she tried to say. "Also, it's cold. It's going to be all wet." How much better it would be, she thought meanwhile, if they could have gone back home cutting straight through the centre. With all the fog around, in the last couple of hours the fog had thickened so much that the yellow lanterns of the street lamps could scarcely still be seen. Nobody, honestly, could have spotted them. Not even if they went by the Listone, not even if they took Corso Gioveca. They would stroll slowly along the damp, clammy pavements, feeling the tepid droplets gathering on their lips and eyelashes, keeping close, like a real, genuine couple, and talking, with a bit of luck, David mostly. What would he be talking about? Perhaps about the film. Some ham actor that lead was, he would say, and the woman too, basically a frump. Or else about himself, about his studies, his plans for the future. At the end, before separating, they might even have gone into a little cafe somewhere, one of the ones around the Saraceno, or on Via Borgo di Sotto. Sitting them down in a corner, David would have ordered a couple of glasses of something, so that then, in the state of torpor, which sipping anise and thinking of bed and sleep just round the corner would have brought on, she would have felt, if not exactly happy, at least fairly all right about herself and about life. But instead she gave in. And straight away, while they were heading in the direction of the walls, past the groups of local youths who, by the wide-open doors of the cinema, were still smoking, loudly discussing sport or who knows what else, or eating roast chestnuts bought for a few pence from the old woman with the black shawl, woolen half-gloves and grey apron who was invariably there, bent over her iron brazier. Straight away began the whistles, the shouts, the mocking hisses, the swear words. Walking faster didn't do any good. As the distance increased, it seemed to make the shouts more strident and more penetrating. They kept up close with her. They were like cold, wet hands trying to grab her, to touch her under her clothes. In the first dark place, the first bit of turf, she would be tipped onto the grass. With her chin above his shoulder, without lowering her eyelids, she let it happen. Afterwards she would be the first to get up. And if, at a certain point, she had felt overcome by the sudden desire to struggle underneath him, to bite him, to try to harm him, and David never put up with that. He would immediately stretch himself out full length and just bear on her with all his weight. Then that fury, that kind of rage that had just made her wrench him away from her suddenly, gave way in her to a terrible sense of dread, of fear. How far away he was already, she thought, while she made the effort to pull him up, to sort out his coat. How it already meant nothing to him now. But why blame him? Had she not been capable of guessing how the evening would end? From the moment they met outside the street door, and then, scarcely exchanging a greeting, set off in a hurry towards the walls, everything was always all too easy to foresee. They went on their way. She knew exactly how matters stood. With his coldness, his distance, everything that she might have from him now could do her nothing but harm. Even so, she liked to tease him. She would ask him, for instance, "What's your mum's name?" And, since David remained silent, she answered for him. "Teresa," she articulated. Wasn't it funny how she asked him such pointless questions, and then, dividing up the syllables like a schoolgirl put on the spot in class, had to answer herself? "And Marina," she went on. "What's your sister Marina called?" She burst out laughing. Then she said, "Marina." Quickening his pace over the frozen ground, David was yawning. But he made the decision to talk at last. He said strange, hard things, in which there was certainly some truth, but also, and it was sufficient to become aware of it to be attentive to the tone which his voice had taken on, plenty that was made up. Mostly he spoke about himself, and particularly about a romantic attachment to a young lady of the very highest society, about whom, without ever revealing her name, he never stopped boasting. Not only of her beauty, but of her fashionable habits, her refined and aristocratic tastes. Their meetings, their disagreements, because they often quarrelled, it seemed, always took place in exclusive surroundings, a charity ball at the Circolo dell'Unione, an upper-class thing then, an opening night at the Teatro Comunale, horse riding in the country leading to no end of a reception at some wonderful villa surrounded by a big park. All in all, it was a tricky relationship, which the two families opposed, of course, but solely because of the difference of religion. An affair, however, in which the kind of thing the two of them had just done earlier would not be mentioned on any terms. Meanwhile, they had come down off the walls and were heading up Via Salinguerra. And if until that moment she'd listened in silence, virtually holding her breath, as soon as she could tell from the shape of the houses and the street lamps that in a few moments they would have to part, this threw her into a state of such nervous agitation that she thought at intervals that she would be unable to keep control of herself. Oh, how she hated them now, her own threadbare coat that was too small for her, her own messy hair that the damp had glued to her forehead, her own common hands, spoiled by work and chilblains. But then again, what could she do at this point except to try to calm herself? Short, without the slightest allure in physique or personality. If only she could have been a bit more of a slut, at least. Since her fate was sealed, from now on she might as well accept it. Who knows? Maybe if from now on she could sort herself out, perhaps David would be grateful to her. Maybe in the future he could bring himself to regard her as an old friend who is allowed to ask anything, able to give any advice, even the toughest sort. Perhaps that wasn't much? No, it wasn't. But it was still better than nothing. Now they were at the door, and they went into the entrance hall. Even though his voice was no more than a whisper, David was still talking. What was he saying? As soon as he'd got his degree, he would say, for example, he was through not just with Ferrara, but with Italy. He was fed up with dragging along in the provinces, mouldering in that hole of a town. Almost certainly he was going to go to America, and to stay, to settle down there for good. And was anybody going with him to America? She had risked asking him once. Was he going alone, or with the young lady whom he liked so much? Alone, he replied curtly. He wasn't the sort to want to marry, he added. Not anybody. Right now the only thing he wanted was a change of air, as he'd already said, and that was that. She made no reply. She just nodded in the dark. But another time, and she regretted it later in bed, when the ticking of the alarm clock on the chest of drawers and her mother's laboured breathing as she slept kept her awake. Another time when she heard this kind of talk from him, it had made her laugh. She'd asked him, "And what if I ended up pregnant?" She was well aware that a question like that would have forced David to stay another 5 minutes. What he might have gone so far as to say in those 5 minutes, she didn't care. What mattered was that before being off, he should feel the need to give her a kiss. The winter of 1929 was exceptionally harsh. To find anything to compare with it, insisted Oreste Benetti, you'd have to go back to the famous one of 1903, when even the Po froze, or maybe also the one of 1917. It began to snow towards Christmas, and snowfall followed snowfall until Epiphany. However, the cold was a long way off reaching the extraordinary lows that it would touch in the months to come. What was more, immediately after Epiphany, there was a brief period of sunny weather, almost spring-like warmth, and the snow was already melting. Can it be trusted? Wondered Maria Mantovani to herself. From her bed, to which she'd been confined since the beginning of December by influenza that left her with a few degrees of fever and a nasty cough, the old woman listened to the splashing of some vehicle passing along Via Salinguerra. No, it couldn't be trusted, she ended up answering herself, the corners of her mouth twisting into a bitter grimace under the coverlet. That warmth, but more than the warmth, all that fog, which, from the early hours of the afternoon, drifted in from the countryside and seemed to drench everything just as if it were rain, would not allow even someone who might wish to harbour the slightest illusion. Before anything else, the moment he came in, he would come in without ringing the bell. It was Lida who some time ago had let him have a key. Oreste Benetti took off his sodden overcoat and hung it from a nail sticking out of the door. Then he came down the stairs, seeming very cheerful. Finally, after sitting himself down, as always, at one end of the table, he began to talk. For a couple of months, which is to say from when Ireneo had been admitted as a boarder at the seminary, the boy had become the main topic of his conversation. Naturally, he said, to reach a decision would take time. However, in his humble opinion, it made sense to start thinking now about what Ireneo might be able to do when he was grown up. The first 3 years of secondary school, those he ought to see out in any event. But afterwards, taking him out of school and getting him into work somewhere, all right, no. But once he'd got his intermediate exams, a choice between the various higher education institutions. It wasn't as if there was only high school in Ferrara, heavens above. There was training college, the Polytechnic, turning out accountants and surveyors, and then the Industrial Institute on Vicolo Mozzo Roversella. A choice one way or the other would eventually have to be made. One evening when he came, he announced with some solemnity that the same afternoon he had been round to the seminary. Having managed to see Don Bonora, the principal who had taken over from poor Don Castelli about 20 years ago, he had asked him about Ireneo. "What can I say?" was the only response at first from Don Bonora. "We've only just made a start on linguistic analysis and parsing. Latin, properly understood, we're still going to have to tackle." He then tried asking him what view he took of Ireneo's character, to which the priest, although continuing to express himself with great tact and delicacy, had replied that, yes, indeed, the boy's character did give considerable pause for thought. It was too early, of course, he added, to be able to make any definitive assessment, but anyway, that he seemed a bit limp, a bit listless. Well, as far as that was concerned, sadly, he didn't think there was much question. The bookbinder bit his lip. Then, abruptly, he started to talk about the weather. "I don't think we're out of it yet," he said, staring up at the ceiling and sniffing the air mistrustfully. "The worst is still to come." And Maria Mantovani, stretched out on her bed at the end of the room, was quick to nod. From the table, where the bookbinder and Lida, as usual, sat opposite each other, all that was to be seen of her was her pale, prominent nose, with the vertical black fissures of the nostrils, smiling silently for some reason of her own. Oreste Benetti was right. The winter's worst was still to come. 2/3 of the way through January, in fact, the sky clouded over again, the temperature dropped, and with brutal gusts tearing in from moment to moment, it began to snow furiously again. It was like being up in the high mountains. Reduced to footpaths, to narrow defiles laboriously kept open by impromptu groups of snow shovelers promptly engaged by the council, the streets, and particularly the minor ones, were closed to all except foot traffic. Then, since from the beginning the city's fortifications pretty well everywhere had become a daily draw for an enthusiastic crowd of novice skiers, most of them students, at a certain point the Fascist Federation decided that in that part of town, and specifically along the stretch of wall leading from Porta San Giorgio to Portareno, they would actually organise competitions, with the result that Via Salinguera, normally so silent and deserted, transformed itself overnight into a thoroughfare full of movement and noise. Suddenly, Maria Mantovani's condition got worse. The fever began to climb. She was breathing with difficulty. A doctor was called and, after a brief examination, promptly declared that it was pneumonia. Was there any danger? There most certainly was, the doctor confirmed, replying to a specific question put by the little man of a certain age, perhaps a relative, by whom he had been summoned. The sick woman's general state of health, which at a glance looked fairly precarious, did not promise a good outcome. As foreseen and feared, the crisis duly began on the 5th day. Maria Mantovani never took her eyes off the window. Beyond the glass, through which the daylight only just penetrated, she could make out the snow falling thickly in spirals. She strained to hear. From Via Salinguera came muffled sounds, cheery shouts and hurrying steps. What was going on there outside? She asked. It seemed as if there were a festival in town. But then why did all the voices, all the sounds, seem to come to her from so far away? I can't hear properly, she complained. I can't hear at all. It's as if I had cotton wool in my ears. It's snowing, Lida answered quietly. She was sitting beside the bed. That's why it seems that way to you. The old woman gave a knowing little laugh. It's not that at all, she murmured, shaking her head. After a couple of hours, the rattle in the lungs began. It was time to think about a priest. And, sure enough, the bookbinder quickly slipped away and appeared a little later with the parish priest from Santa Maria in Vado. In the meantime, the room had filled up with people. On the whole, they were just the neighbourhood women. Nobody had alerted them, and yet they'd turned up of their own accord. How had they managed to get in? Lida couldn't stop herself from wondering. Could it be that Oreste? Oreste. Ah, yes, she thought. Up until then it had never occurred to her to call him just that, just by his first name. Was it possible that Oreste had failed to close the front door behind him? Whatever way it had happened, later, when, after another half-hour, the priest was shown out, the neighbours didn't leave the room. All of them stayed, gathered together under the window with their black shawls over their heads, whispering prayers. Rigid in the centre of the room, Oreste Benetti stood with his hands pressed together. As soon as the rattling stopped, he was quick to come forward and bend over the deathbed. Nimbly and skilfully, his hands closed the staring eyes of Maria Mantovani, crossed her wasted arms above her breast, and finally, with a few experienced touches, went on to smooth the disordered sheets and the quilt which had slipped almost completely onto the floor. During all this time, until when his work was complete, the bookbinder returned soundlessly to his original position. Lida had given no sign of expression or movement. But after, as well, when she could no longer see the big working hands of the man who soon, as she now knew with certainty, would become her husband. Afterwards, as well, there she stayed, seated beside the bed, staring at the waxen profile of her mother. The lowered eyelids, the nose which suddenly seemed larger, stronger, the lips suggesting a vague, absurd, happy smile, the all too familiar features instantly seemed to her different, as if only now was she in a position to register all their details. She could not have enough of looking at the face of her mother. And meanwhile, she felt as if something old, acrid and hard was very slowly melting inside her. She covered her face with her hands and began to weep silently. Afterwards she lifted her head, turning eyes full of tears towards the bookbinder. "Leave me alone," she said in an undertone. "You too, Oreste," she added, nodding. "You go as well." "All right, dearest, all right," he stammered nervously. The neighbours were leaving already. After falling in with their group halfway up the stairs, Oreste was the last one to reach the landing and, closing the door, the last to be lost to view. With her elbow cushioned in the quilt and her cheek resting on her hand, Lida, alone now, thought about her mother, herself, and the lives of the two of them. But she thought about David, chiefly. About David and about the room in the block on Via Mortara, where, at the beginning of a long-ago spring, she had gone to live with him. This is how it had happened. One evening, around the end of winter, that same winter during which, given the boredom and irritability which David gave off with every gesture, every word, she was expecting from one moment to the next to hear him say, "Enough, Lida, it would be better if from now on we didn't see each other again." and waiting for that was destroying her. One evening, just like any other, David suggested straight out that they should set up home together like any working-class couple in that tenement block on Via Mortara. He had decided to leave his family for good, he added, so that he could begin a new existence. They would live in a garret, a lovely poetical garret on the top floor, with a view not only over the whole city, but over the countryside all the way to the mountains beyond Bologna. He, in order to support the family, would find work in a sugar factory. And she? What else was there to do for her if not to say yes straight away, like that other time, the very first, when, meeting by chance in an open-air place in Borgo San Giorgio, she at the time was only just 16, she was really nothing more than a little girl in every respect. They had stayed together the whole evening, and then, towards midnight, had finished up on a bit of grass by the city walls. Once again she hadn't posed herself any questions, hadn't hesitated for a single moment. A few evenings afterwards she left the house with a bundle under her arm that her mother, although as usual she didn't dare mention it, had certainly noticed. And that was that. Madness, quite simply. And yet only later on, much later on, when, after giving birth, she went back alone to the room and the baby wouldn't stop crying, and every day she felt her breasts still more drained of milk, and she only had a few lire left, only then did she begin to wake up from the long daydream that up until that point had been her life. But he, David, who was he? She asked herself now, after so many years. What was he after? What did he really want? In the tenement, in a room on the floor below, lived the family of an orderly at the Sant'Anna General Hospital. They were called Mastellari, and there were 6 of them altogether, the orderly, his wife, and 4 children. In the morning, when she went down with the jug to draw water in the courtyard, she often bumped into Signora Mastellari. "What does your husband do?" she had asked her once. "Does he work?" "Yes. At the moment he's unemployed, but soon he'll be starting in a sugar factory," she replied, happily enough, without for one moment entertaining the suspicion that David, a student, the son of a well-off family, and never mind if he was behind with his degree or through with his family, would never be starting in a sugar factory, ever. A worker, but really. And yet what was it that David aspired to most, if not to being an ordinary worker? Didn't he say it again and again? The truth was that all he had to do was talk, and then everything became simple, easy, possible. Marriage? He himself had always considered marriage to be a farce, he felt quite able to begin by observing. One of the most typical and nauseating bits of bourgeois buffoonery. But seeing that she basically had quite a lot of time for the wedding business, he added with a smile, she shouldn't worry. Within a year at the latest, when he had found work, their civil status could obviously be sorted out. Definitely he would marry her. He didn't feel the slightest qualm about promising it. Faced with her more than justified and understandable aspiration to become at last his wife, his lawfully wedded wife. Not only would he not drag his heels, but in addition he meant to do his best, so that the scheduling of the whole affair might perhaps even be speeded up. In the afternoons, those baking summer afternoons, he generally spent the time flat out, almost always asleep. His breath came so slowly, and his cheeks were so pale beneath several days' growth of beard, that sometimes she, sitting beside his bed, exactly as she was sitting now beside the bed of her mother, couldn't resist the temptation to take him by the arm and give it a tug. "What?" he grumbled, hardly able to get his eyes open. Then, turning towards the wall, the back of his pyjama jacket was soaked with sweat. he relapsed into sleep. As soon as they'd eaten supper, they usually went out. In search of some fresh air, they had got into the habit of staying late at Porta Mare. That fair kilometre separating the tenement from Porta Mare was well worth facing up to. Just beyond the Dazio sluice, there was an ice cream kiosk with about 10 tables and chairs. And ever since she was a girl, as even David knew, she had always really liked ice creams. Taking Via Fossato di Mortara, one could get up onto the walls in a few moments. And it was precisely there, up on top of the fortifications, that on one of those evenings she had suddenly stopped still. "Look, I really think I am having a baby," she had said extremely calmly, putting a hand on David's arm. At that moment he hadn't seemed surprised. There was no reaction from him, not a word. A little later, however, when they'd reached the usual kiosk and she stood there, propping herself against the edge of the zinc counter, dazzled by the light of the acetylene lamp, he had asked her gently, "And which one would you like, lemon or chocolate?" Without seeming to want to sit down, he had already begun to lick his ice cream, the usual mixture of plain and vanilla. But he seemed sad, disappointed. He licked, and meanwhile he looked at her up and down from head to toe. "This evening the heat's well nigh unbearable," he'd exclaimed at a certain point, puffing out his cheeks. "Just think that up in the mountains, as soon as it gets dark, they need pullovers on." He was referring to his family, obviously, who since the beginning of July had gone to Cortina d'Ampezzo. "Where are they staying, your family?" she found the strength to ask. She was licking her ice cream as well now, having decided once more in favour of the chocolate. "In a house?" "No, at the Miramonti. Imagine a kind of castle," he immediately began to explain, "with a wood around it about 6 or 7 times bigger than the Finzi-Contini's park, the one down by the Piopponi, you know, right by the Mora degli Angeli, and at least a 12 times the size of the Montagnone." Who was he, David? What was he looking for? What did he want? And why? These questions had no answer, and would never have one. What's more, it was late. Somebody, probably Oreste, was knocking at the window. She would have to get up to drag herself as far as the doorway onto the street, to tell him that he could come back in. It was Oreste. After rejoining the neighbours down in the entrance hall, Oreste had spent a good half hour with the women talking about what had happened, although mostly listening to them. But then the group had moved out onto the road and dispersed, and he, alone now, had begun to pace up and down in front of the door. He was aware of the clash in himself of 2 opposed feelings, 2 contrasting necessities. On the one hand, he felt he ought to hurry off to shut up shop, so that he could get on with the business of doing the things that needed to be done as a result of Maria Mantovani's death. The thought of Lida was enough to hold him back, though. Several times, bending down so that his face was near the misted-over window panes, he tried to look into the room. At the side of the right-hand bed down there he could make out a small, bent figure, grey and motionless. "What is she doing?" he muttered at a certain point, already with the affectionate impatience of a husband. The first shadows of evening were lengthening. It had stopped snowing, but the cold was biting. The windows of the surrounding houses allowed glimpses of the interiors of kitchens, illuminated parlours. It was time to move to a conclusion, to finish something off. At last, when he had bent over yet again to peer into the room, too dark, he confirmed, it was no longer possible to see anything at all, he decided to tap on the window pane with his fingers. Then he listened as his heart thumped in his chest, until he thought he could hear Lida's footsteps as she came up the internal stairs. At this point he went swiftly into the entrance hall. One instant before she turned the handle and opened, he was already up on the landing. Immediately, at the first glance, he realized that he'd regained the advantage. Resting her back against the doorpost and abandoning her eyes to his, Lida gazed at him silently. That he should protect her. Her attitude expressed no other request. "Heavens above, you're not planning to spend the whole night like this," he said in an undertone, using dialect, almost roughly. Then, still whispering and without moving from the threshold, he set out for her what he meant to do. He needed to hurry off to shut up the shop, and since after that there were one or two other small things which had to be done, he would not be back for at least a couple of hours. However, before he set off for the shop, he would stop for a moment at the home of one of the neighbours, Signora Bedini. Given that this Bedini woman had already volunteered her services, obviously he would ask her to come round. "To do what?" he exclaimed, preempting a foreseeable objection from Lida. "Gracious, to keep you company, to make you a bite of supper, or if not that, at least to say prayers." At the mention of the word supper, Lida had shaken her head to refuse. But the following topic was stronger than any power of hers to resist. She lowered her eyes, and he looked at her, smiling. "So please," he told her, "don't go putting on the door chain. In fact, leave it ajar, all right?" And after squeezing her hand, he went off down the stairs at a gallop. During the night, the temperature plummeted. The feeble pink light which the next morning made its way with difficulty through the ice-encrusted window panes. Lida was stretched out on her bed, the Bedini woman had dozed off on a chair, while Oreste, who had spent large parts of the night in prayer, was standing by the window, scrutinizing the weather. Was the light of a far-away sun, lost in a sky of vague, misty blue, a sun which had no warmth in it. At that moment, Oreste calculated, while he slowly blew into his numbed fingers, his coat collar turned up, on the short, thick hairs which silvered his neck. At that moment the thermometer must be many degrees below zero, 10, 15, 20, who could say? That, however, would make for settled weather. In the course of January, the cold would reach even lower values. The canals out in the countryside, the Reno and even the Po, would freeze, the water pipes would burst, etc., etc., so that the winter would finally end up comparable only to the one of 1903. Would agriculture suffer? Maybe not. He, at any rate, felt rather pleased, and did not in the slightest mind admitting it, pleased that all his guesswork had turned out right. Maria Mantovani's funeral took place in the late afternoon of that same day. The very modest hearse advanced smoothly over the beaten snow, and behind, in addition to the priest and some little assistant, Oreste walked alone. Obedient to his advice, Lida had stayed at home. As for him, Don Castelli's one-time favourite seminarian and the veteran of the Carso, The rigour of the weather instilled in him energy, magically making up for the hours of sleep foregone the night before. He walked with his eyes downcast, at a pace which he instinctively adapted to that of the priest. He never stopped staring at the tracks made in the snow by the high, thin wheels of the hearse, at the little falls of snow which slid from the rims of the wheels and just dusted the glossy black paint of the spokes and springs. When he came back, it was already dark, and entering from the street, instead of knocking at the window as he had done in the last few days, he chose to announce himself by the vigorous ring on the doorbell, which was his alone. Lida was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. She must have slept. In fact, her face, which earlier bore the marks of tiredness, now seemed fresh, rested. She was completely changed. He sat in his old place, leaning his arms together on the table, meanwhile watching Lida bustling around the stove. He did not let a single movement of hers escape him. He observed her with a very particular expression made up of intimate joy and gratitude, which always shone from his eyes, whenever he thought he could detect in what she said or in what she did or simply in her look the effort and the wish to please him. For this evening it would be best to call in Bedini again, he said at a certain point. I'll have to drop in there later on. Tomorrow I've got it in mind to go and see Don Bonora. I think that for the next couple of weeks the boy ought to come and sleep at her place. Afterwards, we'll see. He was now the one making the decisions, providing for the future. After supper, at either end of the uncleared table, they sat and talked. Restricting himself to Maria Mantovani and her life, Oreste spoke about it at length and with immense sweetness. He said that in the course of her existence she had suffered so much, the poor thing, precisely because she had loved so much, because she had had too great a heart. And then he described the place in the communal cemetery, where the following morning she would be laid to rest. It was a really fine position, he assured her, fit for gentry. Hadn't she even seen it yet, the very recently built arcade, which started from the right-hand side of the church of San Cristoforo, and making a big curve exactly the same as that of the arcade beside Via Borso, ended up completing the Mura degli Angeli side of the Certosa. Well, her mother would be buried right there, under those new arches. No, he said for emphasis, facing south, so with the sun from dawn to dusk as if it were a greenhouse. The spot was quite simply magnificent. It's a fact that the burial places on that side, he added after a pause, pursing his lips, don't come cheap. But straight away, obviously fearing he would be misunderstood, he made it clear that please, she, Lida, shouldn't for one moment worry about the cost. In all these years of work, he exclaimed, I've managed, thank heavens, to put at least something aside. And since she, he went on, without managing to suppress a slight trembling of the lip, had allowed him to hope, had allowed him to believe, and also bearing in mind that it would definitely be what her poor mamma would have wanted. What I mean is, you should think of what's mine as being also yours, he concluded, lowering his voice. He leant forward a little, looked her long in the eye. It was the first time, apart from anything else, that he had used the intimate form of address. At last he stood up and, quickly excusing himself, promised that he would be back the next morning. They had just so many things to say to each other. got so much else to say to each other, Oreste would confirm every time he took his leave, or at least his eyes promised it, gravely, very sweetly. In reality, he was the one who always did the talking. When he wasn't letting himself be carried away by the wave of his usual reminiscences, whether regarding the years he had spent as a boy in seminary, or the war in which he later served in the trenches on the Carso, he set off on long monologues, preferably centred on religion, and above all on the recent decisive political events which so closely concerned the Church. After the signing of the Lateran Pact in February of the same year, his patriotism had begun to express itself freely, enthusiastically. "Bravo to the Church," he said, which for Italy's good and that of the world had wisely consigned to oblivion all the issues about trifles and indemnities. But bravo to the Italian state as well, which admittedly deserved the credit for being the first to take the path of reconciliation. And it was obvious when he spoke in these terms that Church and State had acquired for him the characters of a man and a woman who, turning their backs on a long period of difficult relations, often rocked by violent crises, had finally decided to wed. And from now on, how many wonderful things could be expected to happen, he went on to say with exultation in his eyes. The spring, just around the corner, would see the dawning of an era of perpetual peace and joy, the renewal of the mythical Golden Age. As foretold by the Old Testament and the Gospels, as foreseen in the dream and the prophecy of Dante Alighieri, Church and State would recognize that they were substantially in accord. The priest would no longer be the object either of persecution or suspicion. Civil society would no longer push him away, but would welcome him as a father to be listened to and revered. And if at this precise moment the rebirth of a really proper Catholic party, like the PP he meant, was a bit too much to hope for, never mind. For the time being, the results already in were more than enough. It was no small thing, let's be clear about it, to have made sure that the AC and those young men in the FUCI would be left alone. It was no small thing, in fact it was a great deal, to be able once again to give a wholehearted blessing to the red, white and green with the big Savoyard crest, and in it to the flag of one's fatherland. Borne on by the intense emotion which this sort of talk stirred up in him, but changing his tone, he ended up talking about them, about himself and Lida, and particularly about the little house outside Porta San Benedetto, where in May, straight after the wedding, they would go and live. He was complaining about it. He'd had words with the builder because a newly whitewashed wall had given out some damp and seemed stained in places, with the carpenter because of a shutter that didn't work, with the surveyor because of his brusque, discourteous manner. But then, as soon as he went on to describe the little house's setting, how his expression relaxed, completely cleared. The house was at the end of Corso San Benedetto, he said yet again, and he seemed to be getting himself ready to describe various extremely special aspects or even secrets of a faraway city infinitely more lovely and pleasant and welcoming than Ferrara. So, specifically, in the area beyond the walls, more or less between the Dazio sluice and the railway viaduct, where houses of all sizes had been springing up over the last few years. Whether big or little, each property had its own land for keeping as a vegetable patch or garden. The two of them would breathe fresh air out there. Country air. And at this point, as if overwhelmed, the happiness already within view, already within reach, awaited by them both, that he evidently preferred to abstain from describing. At this point he fell silent. May came round. In the last few days Oreste had lost his composure. He suddenly seemed full of fear, of anguish. He had always referred only indirectly to the wedding by signs, allusions, nothing more. Now, however, having been contented for years with a promise not even formulated in so many words, after agreeing to whatever postponements, he wanted to get a move on, not to lose a single day. The date of the ceremony had been decided for some time. They would be married at the beginning of the 3rd week in the month. Well, why not bring it forward, the date of their wedding? He went so far as to suggest. What were they still waiting for? Amazed, Lida looked at him. She didn't understand. Why suddenly all this anxiety, she asked him. Why was he so changed? He didn't reply immediately. He fixed her with a look of desperation, then said quietly, I'm like the kind of horse that falls at the final hurdle. Then he spoke of the marriage, of what marriage meant to him. He said that he regarded it as the supreme goal of his life, because only after being married, not before, he might perhaps find the courage to invoke upon them the protection of divine providence. Ah, yes, he conceded, nodding gravely. Up until then he had never rushed things. But on the other hand, how could he have done, feeling as he did that he could only count on himself? Lida sat and listened. She still didn't understand. However, it was enough when she looked up once more, and then she took it in. Oreste was still afraid of losing her. Stretching across the table, she placed her hand on his, which were knotted together more than ever in their usual convulsive grip. And a moment later, for the first time, she found herself in his arms. The years that followed, hard-working, tranquil, essentially happy ones, gave rise to no events of particular note. Even the winters, said Oreste, who died, however, very early on, in the spring of 38, seemed to have gone back to normal for good. It is true that every year, towards the end of the autumn, he still liked to take up his position in front of the windows, in the manner of someone studying the weather. But he did it not because he felt any doubts, that was quite certain, about the accuracy of his forecasts, which were now more or less stationary around set fair, but rather in order to increase his enjoyment of the intimate pleasure which, of course, he felt as owner of a new, modern house, equipped with everything needed for a comfortable life, including an excellent central heating system. In fact, it was evident that he had no remaining worries about the future in any respect. After the marriage, Lida had immediately conformed to his pious habits, taking up regular attendance at the nearby church of San Benedetto, just within the walls. What was more, she'd put on weight. The thin girl, pinched with anxiety from the years when he had begun turning up at a certain room in Via Salinguerra, had now turned into a lovely wife, calm, serene, slightly plump. What could be better? Sometimes, regarding Lida's looks, they would enjoy a joke together. Less incredulous than she liked to suggest, she would parry back, "Me, beautiful?" "Absolutely so," he replied smilingly, and with a touch of pride he would look her right in the eye. All the same, there was nothing, not even in that, he went on more seriously, to wonder at in the slightest. This new-found beauty of hers, so proper and timely, so wifely, for which it seemed to him not altogether presumptuous to take some of the credit, had come on the scene just in time to demonstrate, had there still been the slightest need, that their union had been looked upon not merely with approval, but actually with pleasure by the good Lord. He was happy, Lida said to herself at times, except that no sooner would she mentally formulate these words than a kind of internal echo was suddenly there, altering them, twisting them. Oozing doubt, painful longing, they would transform themselves into a question to which nobody, least of all she, would have been able to respond other than with a no. Poor Oreste. Even he had not been happy, really, not at all. He as well had always had something missing. And this was amply shown by the extremely tender care, more than paternal, which for years, for all the years of their marriage, he had lavished on Ireneo. When Ireneo had come out of the seminary with his intermediate certificate under his belt, Oreste had immediately taken him with him into his workshop, where he had set up a little bench for him between the sewing machine and the glass door. He had wanted to teach him his trade. And as she, on certain afternoons towards dusk, would walk across half the city to reach the bookbinders on Via Salinguerra, later the three of them together would go back home, taking the Giovecca or Via Mazzini, but always walking past the Café della Borsa right in the centre. She seemed again to see him there behind the high counter, his eyes burning with affectionate zeal as he brooded over his pupil there, who was so bored, so silent, and at the same time so ready to be distracted by the slightest thing happening outside, in the square opposite. She seemed again to see him, to hear him, with his vigorous torso out of proportion to the length of his legs, looming up from the stool on the other side of the counter, and with his big, hard hands, strangely adorned by the wedding ring. He would never be without their ring, not even in 35 at the time of the sanctions, with his strong, cheerful, ringing voice. Oh, how hard he must have struggled so that she, Lida, should be unaware of his wish to have a son. How he must secretly have tortured himself when, almost as if to punish his own desire, to suffocate it within himself, he had even at one point wanted Ireneo to take his surname. Still, despite it all, thought Lida, Oreste had never given up hope. To convince herself of this, she needed to do no more than recall the glance that he gave her every time she came into the shop, a glance which was inquiring, but calm, full of unwavering faith. If not now, that glance of his said, then soon, very soon, she would come to meet him with the great news. She would give him a son who would really be his, of his blood, and therefore different physically and in character from the son whom she had had before marrying him, the one whom, although he had given him his surname, although he was teaching him his craft with all the passion he could muster, nevertheless had never been willing to call him anything other than Uncle Oreste. A son who was really his, thought Lida again. That was what he was missing. That was the only shadow which had fallen across the tranquillity of their married life. To resume his talk of that golden age, the return of which he had predicted in 29, he manifestly was only waiting to hear her say, "I'm expecting." And yet it was apparent, with sufficiency of proof, that his death, which took him suddenly, had forestalled in him the welling up of any notion of despair.